All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webcast on developing an offensive and defensive email security strategy. I'm Matt Petrosky, head of product at Great Horn, and happy to get this going today, and thanks for attending. So just to get us started with a couple logistics, first of all, for most of these, as many of you are aware, you'll be on mute for the duration of the session. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, go ahead and put those into the Q&A chat box. Everyone should have access to that on the right-hand side of the control panel. The webinar is also being recorded, so you'll have access to both the recording and the slides afterwards. So as I mentioned, I'm Matt Petrosky. I'm at Great Horn, and I'm joined today by John Trest from Inspired eLearning. Hi, John. How you doing?
Hi, Matt. Doing great. How are you?
Good to have you. And Barry Jones from dmarcian. Hey, Barry, how are you?
Doing good, Matt. Thanks for having me.
You bet. All right, so just to get us going on the agenda, we want to cover a few things today as we think about this offensive and defensive security strategy. So first, we want to talk a little bit about who and what organizations or entities are sending mail on behalf of your domain. We also want to show you how to empower your users to better understand today's risks. Also then how to measure those risks and measure and track your performance and improvement over time. We also want to improve employees' behavior, both in the office and outside of the office, as they encounter emails, both on their work devices and personal devices. And finally, how to use factual data to help you make these decisions and balance the user's risk profiles in your environment. And we'll wrap up with any questions that come across through the chat box. So we'll bounce back and forth between the three of us today, but Barry's going to kick us off with understanding who and what is sending email on behalf of your organization.
All right, thank you, Matt. So first, let's talk about who and what is sending emails on your domain. So it may come as a surprise to you, but unless you've actually turned off the ability to send email from your domain, anyone could actually be sending. You may have signed up for certain organizations and given them permission to, but there's a lot going on that you probably don't know about and don't approve of. DMARC can give you a lot of insight into exactly what's going on and then help you fix it. Next. And yes, we do mean absolutely anyone. So when you buy a domain for a website, for example, if you want to set up a website, you've got to go and configure your DNS to point to where that website lives. Email is different. When an email server at your friend's domain gets a message saying it's from you, whatever server connected just says, this is from Bob at example.org, please send it to Sally. It doesn't actually have to prove that it's from example.org. It's just a random mail server. The only thing you actually have to configure for your email is how people know how to get messages to your domain. And that's using an MX record in your DNS. But if you've never taken the time to restrict the from, anybody can do it. That's how things work by default. And that's how they work by default for a very long time. And that's why we have so much spam. So how does DMARC help? DMARC works in combination with two other email standards called SPF and DKIM. It uses these standards because you have to understand that due to all of the different rules and inconsistency over the years, every email receiver, every email server that's receiving email has to make up its own rules, because each individual person, an individual company that's out there, does a different level, puts in a different level of work to making sure that their email is being sent properly. So everybody's got to figure out, how do I know this is right? How do I know it's not? That's why you'll see certain different companies saying stuff like, hey, make sure we're in your contact list, because they're just trying to use another rule at some providers. Or you'll see that, Yahoo's sending our stuff to spam, but AOL's not, and that type of thing. DMARC removes the guesswork for the receiving mail servers. What DMARC does is it lets you say, these are the rules for my domain. I've put them in place everywhere. I'm confident that my configuration is right. Stop guessing and trust what I'm telling you now. And then you also get to get a daily report that shows you, how everything looks. Is everything continuing to work well, and so on. Next up. So what are SPF and DKIM? SPF is the Sender Policy Framework. It's a simple DNS record that you put up for your domain that lists all of the IP addresses of servers that might be sending email on your behalf, that you've actually approved to send email on your behalf. Now, there are shortcuts to make this easier. So say if you've gone and set up Google for your email, you would just add in a line that says include spf.google.com so that you don't have to keep up with every IP address that Google might be sending from. And that's the gist of what SPF does. Then we have DKIM, which stands for Domain Keys Identified Mail. And what DKIM does is every sending mail server that you have that's sending email on behalf of your domain includes a private key, or it uses a private key to create an encrypted hash in the message based on some criteria. And when a mail server gets it and it sees this email has a DKIM key, it goes and looks up the corresponding public key from the DNS, and it uses that to say, this email was legitimately signed from this domain. I can be confident that whoever controls this domain actually signed it. And so they can do that. Now, neither of these are perfect. Next. So SPF, for example, putting all the IP addresses in seems like it would be the short, sweet, to the point way to end things. But there's a lot that goes on with email that's out of your control, such as mailing lists. Now, if you send an email to a mailing list that then sends the email back out to everybody else on the list from you, or if there's a forwarding address that maybe your school set up for you after you graduated that sends to your real email, when the message is delivered to you, it's not actually coming from a server that's in your control. It's coming from the relay server that was responsible for those lists. And so if you have an SPF policy that's too strict, you'll end up getting legitimate messages, not being delivered. With DKIM, on the other hand, we've got a different set of issues. So DKIM doesn't have that weakness that SPF has. It survives forward, which is great. It's using an encrypted hash, and just like other encryption algorithms, you'll hear about the strength of 512, 1024, 2048, 4096. In terms of how many bits are used in the encryption, and the higher the better. 1024 should be considered the minimum that's out there. Key strength matters because you don't want it to be something that can be easily cracked. Key rotation also matters. You've got to periodically change these keys out just in case one of them was cracked for some reason, or if it was stolen or compromised in some other way, just like a password. It's something to keep in mind. But the real issue with DKIM is that when a mail server receives email, if there's not a DKIM key present, it has no way of knowing if there was supposed to be one. And so you can't just say, if the message is missing my DKIM key, don't deliver it, or it's not for me, because it has no way of knowing, did they really set this up everywhere? All right, next.
And Barry, real quick, on the SPF front, you mentioned these relay servers. Are there limitations to what can go into the SPF record, and do folks try to put those relays in there?
Yes, they do. So you can put 10 different DNS lookups in your SPF record, and so that's the cap to what the standard allows. And so if you've got over that, if your SPF record becomes invalidated because you've got too many lookups in it, a lot of receiving mail servers will just discard it entirely and ignore it. You can put a lot of IP addresses in, as many as you can cram into all the records that you can leave in there. But the key to doing this is that when you're sending messages with SPF, there's nothing that says the sending server has to be using an SPF record on the top of your domain. You can set up a subdomain for certain servers and just include the SPF authentication in the subdomain. So you can always break things into smaller pieces according to those subdomains, and it's an easy way to beat that 10 lookup problem.
And the ordering matters too, right? Because I think that I've run into that personally setting up domains, is that the order matters, right?
It can. That's sort of subject to interpretation. So if a mail server is receiving, it's going to go through things in order. And so it'll be able to check certain things in order. If for some reason you've gone over the total number of lookups, if it just decides to stop checking after a certain number of lookups, if you're in that first 10, then it can matter. But if you've gone over, it will tend to run out after that. Certain mail servers may be more forgiving. And so that's very much implementation dependent. Best thing to do is just to try to stay under those 10 though.
Okay, super, thanks.
All right, so when it comes to SPF and DKIM, independently, they've both got a lot of good things going on, but combined, they make up for each other's weaknesses and give you a really solid approach to making sure that everything can be authenticated and proven that it's from your domain. So DMARC lets you publish a record that essentially tells a receiving mail server, if a message says it's from my domain and it doesn't pass one of these, either SPF or DKIM, then you can tell it to quarantine the messages by throwing them in the spam folder, or you can tell it to reject the messages and just not even deliver them at all. Now, this doesn't guarantee delivery. They're still going to use other spam algorithms and everything to see if you've got perfectly authenticated mail that's still spam, it might not get through, but this will at least let them verify this is from somebody who controls this domain. And if it doesn't pass this, I can put a much higher degree of doubt on everything else that comes in. SPF is going to cover most of your bases. You get to identify all the sources where you're sending messages from, and then DKIM will cover that other corner case of forwarding by making sure that if something was forwarded and there's a DKIM key in there also, that key is going to survive it and it will still pass authentication. So DMARC provides the authoritative rule for both of them without you having to have an overly strict policy on either of the lower two protocols, and lets you control exactly how strongly they're enforced. DMARC also adds another layer though called alignment. So we talked about DKIM and the public-private key signing of a domain. There's nothing that stops you from signing an email from example.org from some other completely random domain and including the DKIM signature. And that would actually technically pass DKIM even though the domains didn't match up. It's not good enough to pass DKIM for DMARC though, because the domains have to be in alignment. So if you have a subdomain key for a DKIM key that's using your same domain, so we'll say dmarcian.com, for a message that's sending from dmarcian.com, that will pass. But if I send a message that says it's from dmarcian.com and I have it signed with example.org, it's going to pass DKIM, but it won't pass the DMARC DKIM check because the domain names are not aligned. All right, next up. All right, so how do you go about rolling out DMARC? Now, all that stuff sounds really, really complicated. I understand that. And so the one thing that people are really worried about when they're setting up a domain that's already sending a lot of email is they don't want to disrupt anything. DMARC makes that really, really easy. So to start with, you just put out a simple DNS record and you set your policy, your enforcement policy, to none. That just means this record is basically here for decoration. Don't change anything you're doing because it's here. But it lets you go ahead and put in an email address to get a daily report of everything that is going on with your email, so that you can see how good you're doing across the board and go through the process of monitoring these reports to try to get things in line so that you can eventually enforce the policy. Now you use an aggregate reporting address, we call it an RUA address in there, where you put in an email address where you want those reports to be sent. And so email servers that get email claiming that it is from your domain will end up sending these reports back to you, usually daily. So Google, with all the domains that they have and all of the and the various Gmail addresses and everything, all the messages that they get over the course of the day that say that they are from your domain, they'll send you a report at the end of the day saying, here's all the IP addresses of servers that sent email to us saying they're from your domain. Here's how many we got. Here's the IP addresses of them. Here's how many we got from each IP address. Here's the information that we found in the headers of where it said it was from. And here's whether or not they passed DKIM and passed SPF. and you can just see it right there in the report. The reports come in as a zip XML file, so they're easy for systems to parse. They're harder for people to read, but they're easier for systems to read. And you get those reports every day, and you can go through and you can see, you can make sense and try to track down which IP addresses are yours, which ones belong to your servers, and get a picture of your infrastructure in there to see how everything's doing every day. And then once you're confident that everything that you have is in a state where everything's passing SPF and everything's passing DKIM, then you turn up your policy level and you bump it up to the quarantine level and say, okay, if you get something from me and it doesn't pass these things, but I already know everything's going to pass because I've got the reports that show it, send it to the spam folder. And that way it lets you be a little bit cautious as you're rolling it out. So you roll it out and you say, okay, this doesn't pass, send it to the spam folder. If I start getting support calls saying they're not getting email, we can tell them to check the spam folder. And if that happens, maybe we can roll it back down and back down to none while we investigate what's going on. You can also do this for a small portion of your email. There's something called a percent tag, where you can say, okay, here's my policy. I want it to be a quarantine policy, but I only want it to apply to 5% of the messages that you get because I'm not quite sure about this yet. And so you can do that without having to worry about it impacting every email that you're sending out during the day. You can also do this on a subdomain by subdomain basis. There's nothing that requires it to be just the top level. But then once you're confident that everything's there, then you can eventually turn it up to reject. And any messages that come in to those email receivers, if it's not passing both SPF and DKIM, they're going to get discarded. They're not even going to bother your users. Next. Now, I know those reports are a lot to look at, but luckily DMARCian has lots and lots of tools to help you make sense of these things. We've got tools to help you inspect your different records as you're building them to make sure they're correct, to give you information about them, to give you options that are there. You can look deep in your SPF records, see what's going on there. We even got an XML to human converter tool where you can just upload one of these reports to it. And we can also provide you with an email address that those reports can be sent to automatically and then help you make sense of what these things belong to, more than just email addresses. We can help you kind of group things by sources. Is this from Google? Is this from Microsoft? That type of thing. That's the high level of DMARC. And now I'm going to turn it over to John to help you better understand security awareness training.
Thanks, Barry. So I want to talk about a few pain points that are pretty common for those who have to deploy security awareness training programs. And one of the first things is really, how do you get your learner to pay attention to the material? So what studies basically show is that adult learners really need to see the value in the training material for them to really pay initial attention to it. And what's in it for me, essentially. So something we always strive for is to present how practicing these best practices, proper cyber hygiene, how does it protect them, their job and their families, in bringing these lessons back to the home as well. Next. Another big consideration. So we've got them to pay attention. Now, how do we keep their attention? How do we keep them engaged in the material? So adult learners also need to relate what they're being trained on back to their everyday, their day-to-day situation, right? So scenario-based simulations is a good way to go, look, someone receives this email, does it look like it's a phishing email, so on and so forth. Really relate that back to what they commonly have to deal with. And also really kind of focus more on what they need to know for their specific roles in the organization, not what's really nice to know or sort of fluff material that they really don't need to engage too much on and waste their time with. Next slide. And okay, so I've gotten them to pay attention, and so they're looked at the material. How do I get them to remember after the training session is done? So unfortunately, there is, learners basically forget material pretty quickly over time. So if you're looking at this graph, on the left side is what we call a forgetting curve, this blue line that goes down. And basically, a learner can lose as much as 70% of what they've just been taught over 24 hours, and as much as 90% over a couple of weeks. So this is natural, and so what you don't want to do is a sort of one and done compliance approach to your training where you taught them, cybersecurity best practices, and then you wait a year and you talk about it again. So they really can't help the organization over that time unless you do reinforcement of the material. So certainly you can do more training, and we have a broad catalog of courses that people will deploy for training. But another good use of that is practical exercises. And so using a threat simulation platform such as ours, Phishproof, basically does phishing simulations that you can deploy to your learners on a monthly basis, really reinforces what they've learned. It gives them a chance to actually practice it, right? So that's a good way to reinforce the material and allows them to retain it over time. Because as you can see in this graph, the more chances they have to review information over this time, the easier it is for them to remember the information over the span of the year. And so this actually produces someone who's going to be much more a proper human defense for the organization. Next slide.
Yeah, John, I think the curves have gotten even steeper since I've been home, working from home the last few months. For organizations that have typically done like one big training throughout the year, do you have recommendations for how they can sort of ease into or best practices for getting these more frequent opportunities in front of their employees?
Yeah, so a lot of organizations, or I say majority of organizations, have shown that they only have, they have less than 2 hours that they can devote to training over the course of the year. So, if you're in a situation like that and you really need to do that initial foundational course, that basically baselines your staff and everything, that's fine. If you can't do training later in the year, hopefully you can do simulations, but if you can't, then reinforcement within the environment is another way to really provide that or help with retention. So, back in the days when we were in the office, it was a little easier because you had, posters in the break room, you could do videos, digital signage in hallways, things that really made cybersecurity top of mind. But even with remote staff, there's also, email blasts, communications, just reaching out and reminding them, if you have, screensavers that are set up on these laptops and desktops, that works as well. So it's just ways to bring it top of mind so that they're not forgetting these best practices over time, which is sort of the natural state of, forgetting. So.
Yeah, that's great. Those are good tips because it doesn't have to be, like you said, a 2-hour eye-rolling session.
Oh, I hope not. Yeah, that doesn't really help. So economic impact. So the other, to your point, if you can employ the type of training that's really need to know, doesn't need to be these huge 2-hour courses, you really kind of want to trim it down to what an employee really needs to know to help protect against the major attacks, the major threats in the landscape. And utilizing that approach, you can really save 50% of the time that you would normally spend doing security awareness training during that year. And then, one of the obvious impacts as well is if you can employ phishing simulations over that time period to reinforce that, you can really drop phishing related incidents down to, down 75% that we see typically in organizations. So there's a big economic impact to having not just a security awareness training program in place, but really a proper approach to that. So let me hand this back to Matt, who's going to talk about more of the prevalent types of phishing attacks that are out there currently in the landscape.
Yeah, thanks, John. And it's a good segue too, because a lot of the things that you can help raise employees' awareness to, attackers are using those techniques in email to try to compromise employees or data. And these are the 4 most popular types of phishing attacks: impersonations, payloads, the content that's in the message itself, and then also credential theft, getting employees to click on links. And if we think about the risk associated with each one of those and how we can better train and make employees aware of them, and then also as a security team, how we can respond to these, impersonations kind of get lumped together with both spoofs and impersonations together, trying to trick an employee either of the sender or the sender's organization. And it's often for financial gain, getting folks to change routing numbers or bank account numbers, getting them to listen to or click on a voicemail or fax receipt. And there's various ways that you can, again, raise awareness to these. You can banner some of these and raise awareness to an employee that says, hey, this may not be our voicemail system. Please be careful before opening it. Or also analyzing some of the fingerprints that Barry talked about with DMARC, DKIM, and SPF, and making sure that they're being validated and signed to validate that the sender is who they say they are. Second one is malicious payloads. And while I think attachment-based attacks are on the decline, link-based attacks are definitely on the increase. And so again, a very similar set of circumstances where an employee receives these. Attackers are very crafty at making the subject line or the body be attention grabbing to create urgency or a sense that maybe the employee is doing something wrong. The attachment-based attacks are often used to get employees to download malware or create an entry point for an attacker. And so you want to layer on defenses around scanning those attachments, looking at links, making sure those links go to legitimate websites, and blocking ones that don't. On the content front, this is often trying to take advantage of an employee's role in the organization. So somebody who is a developer, maybe asking them for developer software information that might be proprietary or confidential. Somebody who's in finance could be asked to, again, change routing numbers or banking information. Lots of folks are now getting these requests to go out and buy iTunes gift cards and then send the attacker the codes from the back so the attacker can cash them in. Here you can see an example of layering in a banner where it could be somebody who's your president or your CEO or your boss asking you for this urgent request. Well, if you can identify that the underlying information is not associated with that individual, you can warn the employee or the recipient and say, hey, this isn't the address that you usually receive mail from this person. Be careful responding to this request. So that's where we can use additional factors like relationship strengths. How often does that sender and recipient interact or exchange email, and use that as another factor to determine the legitimacy of the email. And then lastly, credential theft. This is becoming quite a prevalent method to get information about employees, get their credentials, and then move laterally within an organization. And these often come in the form of a password reset looking email. They can also become more common now. We've seen since folks have been working from home, Zoom or GoToMeeting are often targeted to get employees to reset their passwords, or they're late for a meeting. And those are ways to get employees to enter their credentials on a page that looks legitimate. It's not hard for an attacker to copy a web page from a legitimate organization and put some malware or some forms that are harvesting credentials on there. And so again, we have some various recommendations for scanning those links or looking at the destinations with machine vision and ensuring that the destination web page is where it says it's going to go to, and does it belong to the organization that you think you're entering the credentials into. So all of those methods are useful in helping employees identify messages that might be suspicious and helping them report those. I'll go back over to John for some thoughts on measuring that risk that employees pose to the organization.
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, analytics is obviously a big consideration too when it comes to your training administration. And so one of the things that we do right off the bat is we have something called SIQ, or basically security awareness assessments, that you can deploy out to your employees. And it basically covers what are the different threats out there in the cyber threat landscape. How well do they understand social engineering, let's say, or specifically phishing? And that way, training administrators can see where their biggest risks are, and allows them to really, we were talking about reinforcement earlier, then deploy out the material that's going to have the greatest impact for where their biggest vulnerabilities are. And you're talking about the whole organization, but maybe sales or engineering has specifically certain things that they're not as familiar with. So you can deploy it to certain departments and certain roles potentially to really address that as quickly as possible. So it's just an insight that we can provide for people to basically tailor their training over the course of the year. Next slide. Another analytics that's a good metric really is, so how well are we doing with phishing, right? So you have the phishing simulation is out there. You can see basically how your users are doing against these email campaigns over the course of the year. Now, if you use a combination of the phishing simulations on a monthly basis, which is what we recommend, coupled with the coursework, organizations can basically drop their user susceptibility to phishing attacks from somewhere around 30% down to typically 2 to 4%, which is a big drop. From there, we have multiple remediation courses for people who continue to click these malicious links or attachments, and provide further training for those who really need it to get better at this. Now, I would note that it's not just phishing. Organizations have various vectors as well. So smishing, phishing, which has been on the rise recently with people being remote, as well as USB baiting, are all things that you can track and see how well you're doing with susceptibility rates over time. Now, Matt, I want to hand this back to you because I know you're going to talk about how in the moment alerts can also work to improve user behavior, right, when it comes to these phishing attacks.
Yeah, that's right, John. And thanks for that, because most of the tools that you've been describing, you're really not trying to trick the employees, right? Like that's not the goal of a phishing simulation or an awareness training is to trick them and make them feel bad, like the security team got them this month. Really, like you really want them to be a part of the solution and engage employees and again help engage them as part of that security suite. And so a lot of folks are checking email now away from their primary device, whether it's a laptop or a desktop. I know I check my email throughout the day, primarily on my phone, but oftentimes on a tablet. And throughout the day, especially again because we're working from home and distracted, I'm not always thinking about cybersecurity top of mind. And so you want to give tools to employees to help them make better decisions in the moment. And this is an example of where you can show an employee, how well do I know the sender of this message, and help reinforce some of the SPF DKIM DMARC certifications that Barry's been talking about, and put it into a user-friendly format for a recipient. Also, how well do my colleagues know this individual? And again, looking at some of those analytics of how often a sender interacts with both my employees on an individual basis, but also on an aggregate basis, and sharing that information to help somebody make a better decision. And then lastly, is it really from that person, and using those authentication measures to present that to the employee. And you can also engage them to help report things that they see as being suspicious or odd. And so giving them the ability to mark something as spam, and then preventing future messages from that sender is one powerful tool, but then also reporting it as phish and escalating that to your security team. And that may be an indicator that something is awry and an account has been compromised, and the security team can take more effective broad measures than an individual could.
Yeah, the report as phish button, it seems like a very effective way to really get people to do what you want them to do, right? So you're making it a lot easier for them to go ahead and report, which is what you want them to do, right? You don't want to make it a long or a drawn out process. Is there feedback as well that comes when they report a phish?
Yeah, you can, for sure. And it's often important to give the distinction for an employee, right? Like somebody could mark messages from a colleague as spam, but it might not necessarily be phish. And so you don't want to bombard the security team with those types of messages being reported as phish, which then in most organizations kicks off an investigation. But you can do things like, once an employee starts monitoring something or reporting something as phish, the security team could find all the other messages that have similar characteristics in the environment, and then insert one of those banners for every other employee and say, hey, one of your colleagues reported this as phish, we're investigating it, be careful interacting with it, and give the security team a chance to take a look at it before other people start engaging with it. So you can definitely engage other employees and close that loop as part of that report option.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So I would imagine, for a learner, when you submit that report, being able to see it automatically have some sort of effect, that helps a lot with encouraging people to actually report phishing. So that's great.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I've even seen some of your samples on the phishing campaigns where if an employee clicks on a phishing link, it doesn't berate them. It sort of encourages them and shows them, this is what you should be doing, or this is the activities that you would do better in the future.
Oh, yeah. So you want to take that, it's like in the moment we were talking about before, like that's a great time to actually give them a learning a lesson, basically. But unfortunately, a lot of people will get scared if they see something pop up that they're not expecting. So yeah, I mean, we don't want to scare them off. We want to make sure that they read a little bit to understand what's happening or why they even ended up on this page and to learn for the next time. So yeah, the people are skittish when they're clicking on these. So yeah, it's very important.
All right, super. And so to wrap this up and bring some of the key pieces together, if we think about bringing some of the facts that we have both from the awareness training and phishing simulations that John was talking about and some of the scores that employees are getting, you can start to combine those facts with the facts about a message and really do some interesting things in terms of timely training and enrollment. So are the facts that an employee is receiving messages related to PII or certain content, let's enroll them in a timely training that says, hey, it's relevant to you because we can see factually that you're receiving or sending messages related to these topics. Let's go ahead and reinforce that as John was showing on that chart. Also, vice versa, if we start to track how employees are doing in those courses or phishing simulations, we can start to adjust how we respond to the messages that they receive. Employees would have different risk profiles, and so the response to those different employees could and should be different. So giving companies the tools to be able to dial that response up and down is a key part of this integration. And then on the DMARC and authentication front, you can do a lot with the data that we're getting around errors that are being returned, impersonating domains or IP addresses, doing investigations and having the data at your fingertips to factually say, oh, I see this new domain is impersonating us, but oh, I also see here's the registration email to somebody on the engineering team who just enrolled for a new service or product. Now I know who to contact and make sure that that's a valid use of our domain and email signatures. You can also, once we do the foundational elements that Barry introduced that are excellent hygiene, you can do some advanced capabilities around those and say things like, if my message not only passes DMARC, but did it also pass SPF and DKIM? Because as Barry mentioned, it's an either or for the DMARC pass or fail. Now I can do something that says, I want to make sure that my email is passing all three. And if it doesn't, I could do things like banner or quarantine or restrict access to those messages.
Exactly. And as the receiving server, as the one who's finally getting the message at the end, especially when it comes to your own domain, you can see any messages that are coming in from certain domains and whether or not they're going through relays or forwarders first. So you can decide, if we're getting stuff from PayPal and it always comes directly to us and it's always passing SPF and DKIM, only let it through if it's passing both. Because you're the receiver, you don't have to worry about the forwarders in the middle. So you can apply more strict policies based on those DMARC protocols for that. And that'll also help you to do things like minimize BEC attacks, just so that you can make sure that if somebody were to ever compromise a DKIM key, they would still have to be able to get access to one of the IP addresses that's actually in your SPF record to be able to impersonate one of your executives.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Barry. All right, super. So to wrap things up, hopefully today we've given you an example and showed you some best practices for how combining three innovative, best-in-class solutions in a layered approach can really add some protective capabilities on top of whatever your base email suite might be today, and how the combined benefits of our three tools together really help organizations step up their game and protect their employees, both proactively and also reactively. All right, I'll pause now and check the questions in GoToMeeting to see if anything came in while we were talking. Barry, I think I have one here for you. I think on your slide, you mentioned that the DKIM strength matters and the rotation of those keys matter. Do you have any examples or anecdotes around why those do matter?
Yes. So a long time ago, before people were really paying that much attention to this key strength, there was a mathematician who got an email from Google, and he was in the process of applying for a job with Google. And he thought that it was a strange recruiting test because he looked at the email and realized that it only had a 512-bit key, which for him was very easy to crack. So he cracked Google's DKIM key and sent an email from Larry Page to Sergey Brin. Within 2 days, Google had a 2048-bit key. That's a story that I always like to tell because it does happen. And if your private key is compromised for one of the various options that you have out there, people can send email that's passing DKIM that will look completely legitimate according to DMARC, and they can send it from anywhere. And so having a higher strength key makes it harder to crack, but cracking isn't the only thing that's a danger. If a system that housed that private key was compromised and somebody obtained that key directly, or whether it was from someone internal at the company who left and was upset and passed that key along, those keys can still leak out there just the same type of way that passwords can be compromised when a server is compromised. And so rotating them periodically is important. And most of the third-party services that you'll set up to send email on your behalf, when you set them up, they will actually delegate the DKIM publishing to their own DNS, where they can control it as the sender. And a lot of them now will even have you set up 2 or even 3 DKIM records, so they can automatically rotate these things on the messages they send. They'll start sending everything from the first one, and then the next week they'll send everything from the second one, and then the next week they'll change the first one to something different and start sending everything from that again. And that way they can safely rotate these keys as they go through.
Okay, super, thanks. One more for you, Barry.
Sure.
Is there anything that anybody on the call today would have to do to get DMARC records or those reports either going outbound from their server or receiving those inbound, or does that all happen automatically?
It depends on who's receiving them. Most of the major providers in the world now send DMARC reports automatically. I know that at one point Office 365 took a break for it from a little while, and it might be a feature that you have to turn on manually in some cases. There are other, depending on what type of corporate servers are out there, it may be a setting that's off by default for them to send the DMARC reports out to people who are sending email in, but it should, in most cases, be on by default. As soon as you publish that DMARC record and put that address in, you will start to get messages. You will start to get those reports back on usually a daily basis from different places all over the internet about everything that they see that is coming from you. And not necessarily just coming from you. We actually see a lot of people who are very surprised when they get their first report. They'll identify some messages that are definitely from them, and then they'll see 5 times as much traffic that is not from them at all, just pretending to be them. People just saw a vulnerable domain and started sending email pretending to be it.
Yeah, I'm sure some of those reports are eye-opening.
Yeah.
John, a quick question for you before we wrap. Someone asked on Matt's slide, I mentioned PII or HIPAA. In addition to security training, does Inspired eLearning offer courses and other solutions, and do you track employees' performance against those topics?
Oh, so we do offer privacy, certainly. So PCI, GDPR, CCPA, various compliance material on top of the straight security awareness training. So yeah, no, I mean that can be tracked in the system just as any of the other courseware, and then also seeing how well users are doing against understanding on privacy, let's say specifically, you can see that in the dashboard.
All right, excellent. All right, super. Well, we're at 45 minutes and keep that to our time today. So thanks everyone for attending, and we'll conclude the webinar at this point and share out slides and the recording afterwards. Thanks again. Thanks, John. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Take care.